Welcome, everybody. We sure appreciate your joining us today, and I can tell you, you are in for a treat. I'm Sandy Runkle with Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and we are a statewide division of the Villages of Indiana. And, back in the day, we would, be doing a lot of things in person, and it's just not the way of the world right now, and that's okay because we've had lots of wonderful opportunities for virtual trainings, and today is no exception. You're really going to learn a lot and really be moved and inspired by this conversation. That being said, we still want you all to take care of yourselves. If you need to get up and get a drink or anything like that, or just take a break, just, please practice self-care. But we are so happy that you are here joining us today. We also want to acknowledge the Kids First Trust Fund, those cute little license plates that you see with the hands. We are funded primarily by the Kids First Trust Fund, and we always want to give them a shout out. They've been so supportive of us over the years. So the next time your license plate is up, please consider buying a Kids First Trust Fund. The money that goes toward those license plates, it goes towards organizations and entities whose mission is the prevention of child maltreatment. So please keep that in mind. So I'm going to introduce Katherine King right now. She's our wonderful, wonderful program assistant, and she's going to talk you through a little bit of the logistics about the training today. So Kathy?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. And I've been with Prevent Child Abuse Indiana in the Villages for 22 years. So I'm just new at doing the Zoom and the webinars, but we're hanging in there together. After the webinar, I will send you a short survey. And if you could please fill that out and get it back to me as soon as possible. That's how I'm going to send you your certificate of your training certificate. So once I get your survey back within 12 to 24 business hours, I will be emailing you your training certificate. And it is good for foster parents, not only the Villages foster parents, but also foster parents in the state of Indiana through the Department of Child Services, and also for a Villages staff. It's good for training hours, and probably through your own agency if you work outside the Villages, and many of you do. They're not technically CEUs per se. I guess they're level 1. Is that how that works, Sandy?
Level 2. So these would go toward level 2 CEUs for social workers. So
anyway, I'll send you your certificate. If you don't get it, please email me. And my email is kking.pcain@villages.org. Give me a reasonable amount of time and I'll get that to you. But if not, like I say, give me an email. And if you registered as a couple or as a group, I'm going to need each person to do the survey themselves. That way I know who all attended, and you can have your certificates. If you're a Villages foster parent, make sure to turn your certificate into your social worker so they can give it to the admissions and the people that take care of your tracking your training hours. And I can't really think of anything else I need to say right now, but if you have a question, you can type it in the chat box. And at the end, Jay's going to do a question and answer. And at that time, we're going to try to see if you raise your hand, we can allow you to talk and say your question. So that's it for me right now. We are recording this to put on our website, but nobody can see your face. So, if you have a problem with that, let us know. Thank you. Back to you, Sandy.
Thanks, Kathy. So I would like to go ahead and introduce Jay. Jay Watts, who prefers the pronouns she and they, is a diversity scholar and Afrosexologist specializing in healing and trauma. She is also the executive director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Belonging in Central Indiana at Ivy Tech Community College and the president of Affirming. Jay is studying and researching healing-centered engagement on the doctoral level and is a board member of the Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana. So, Jay, I am going to hand it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone that took some time out of their day to get a little bit more education on, a topic that should mean the world to us is how do we serve our youth in a greater capacity, right? Within my diversity, equity, and inclusion work and belonging work, a lot of my focus is higher education, but we would be remiss to not note that before individuals get to that space where they're even ready to be educated, or ready to be in the space where they can grow intellectually, they have to have those basic needs met. When we think of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, that first tier is really those basic needs. And those basic needs are the housing, the shelter, the food, the water, but also that psychological safety. And if we're not tailoring that towards our youth, then we are not able to bloom our future scholars, our future people that will be in different fields of work, not just within higher education, but our future business owners, our future restaurateurs, our future individuals that are doing plumbing work and contracting work. We can't do that unless we create empowering spaces. And within this work of preventing child abuse, we'd be remiss to not mention that creating and affirming an empowering space for children that are representing our LGBTQ plus community is essential. So today we're going to learn a little bit about what that means and what that means for you all, and particularly in a social services space, in a child welfare space, but also individuals that may be foster care advocates or foster care parents or adoptive parents or interested in being in that particular space as well too. What do you need to do to blossom youth, and also feed your own knowledge in this space as well too? And hopefully technology does not evade me today. There we go. So before I begin, I always like to create a space of healing and transformation. So feel yourself in this moment. In this moment, you may be filled with stress and anxiety, cold. The weather has been very unkind, but I also want you to take a deep breath and situate yourself in this moment and just know that we're committed to each other and we're committed to learning from each other. This is not a one person just being a sage on the stage, where you feel that your power is being disrupted. This is where we're learning together. And if we can create that tone and set that tone, then we can create greater transformative spaces. It takes more than just one person to have that. It takes the full community. So we're going to have this community environment where we're going to pour. And we're going to pour life and learning into each moment. And that means they're going to participate, utilize the chat. Feel free to raise your hand as well too. I was educated initially as a social studies teacher, and I am totally okay with taking a pause and listening as well too. We're going to be open and honest in dialogue. We're going to have some understanding and accountability. So that means that in order for this to really sink through, in order for us to be able to cater towards diverse communities, we have to listen. We can't devalidate. We can't be abusive. We have to understand our role in it as well too. And if we do that, then we can create transformation and have some understanding and accountability. If we're harmed in this space, naming those feelings, naming those actions. It may be uncomfortable because for certain people that is new for them. We're so used to holding in baggage and holding in pain and putting a smile on our face. But in this space, I want us to name those feelings and own it. That's how change happens. It doesn't happen when people are silenced. And we're going to have a respectful and restorative justice environment, meaning that if we are harmed in this space, if we feel that we are wronged in this space, we're going to advocate for healing and support. So just a brief introduction of myself, and I so appreciate Sandy and her wonderful introduction of me as well too. I am Jay. I am a Black queer Afro-Latin. So I grew up in Eastern Kentucky. That is my background. And a little small town outside of Richmond, Kentucky called Poozy Ridge, where that really informed me of my experiences when it comes to healing and diversity and being queer as well too. I have several degrees. I have 2 master's degrees, and I'm almost finished with my doctorate in less than a year. And I am in sex counseling supervision with ASECT. I am a veteran sex educator as well through OLEASE. And my focus is in healing and transformation. My focus is with working with youth. My focus is working with anyone that feels that there needs to be this space where they can be their greater self. Outside of this professional work, I'm a political and faith consultant. I own Diverse Affirm Group, LLC. I am a member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. And I also do some great work with our near Northwest where I reside as well too. So I'm so excited to be in front of you all, even virtually. So before we begin some meat of our work, I always like to start with a quote. And this quote is about necropolitics and something that may be new in your framework and your knowledge. This word means necropolitics is the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die, hence to kill or to allow to live. And when you're thinking of this, you're probably thinking of a physical death, right? You're thinking of someone actually declaring that it's okay for certain people to not physically live. But we have to also think broader when it comes to this as well, too. When you're thinking about living and thriving, you're thinking of individuals able to live their best lives, to be happy in a space, to be able to have their needs met, to have their resources, to be affirmed in their voices, to not be silenced and stifled, and to be heard in that moment. And somehow within society, we have dictated whose voice should matter in a space, who should be comfortable in a space and who should not be comfortable. And when it comes to our LGBTQ plus youth, we know that that is a salient narrative. We know that within communities on the margins, that we have prioritized which voices are legitimized and which voices don't matter in this particular space. So we have the power. Everyone on this call has the power to prioritize the living of our LGBTQ plus youth. When I say prioritize, that means to put it in a space where we say that we really legitimately want to allow them more than just to live physically, but to manifest greatness. And what greater opportunity than to work with populations and that are part of the child welfare system as well too. So a little bit of an overview of today's training. And I call this a little bit of a mini training because we're going to do about an hour and a half versus like content. And then we're going to do 30 minutes of some questions and answers. Maybe even some think tanking as well too about what do we do? How can we transform? We can write the roadmap, we can write the plan, but if we're not enacting it, if we feel that something is being taken away from us in the process, then we're not able to do the work. So today we're going to learn about basic vocabulary. We're going to do a basic vocabulary check. LGBTQ plus is a large umbrella. It has some wording and vocabulary that you all may need to know in this particular space. But there's also some other information that if you feel free to reach out to me as well too, that we won't necessarily have time to get into. We're going to do some exploring of trauma of the LGBTQ plus youth as well too. Implications for social services, some best practices for creating LGBTQ plus affirming child welfare. Out of the home best practices for families and some agency best practices as well too. We're going to talk about this major topic that Sandy dropped on us as well too, part of my doctoral research, is healing-centered engagement. Taking it a little bit step forward from this trauma-informed care to being able to be healing-centered engaged, affirming people, having a community investment. We're going to talk about some resources and have some time for questions and answers. So quick vocabulary check. LGBTQ plus and LGBT may be utilized simultaneously in this space, but just know it's still under the same umbrella. The L meaning lesbian, the G meaning gay, the B meaning bisexual, the T meaning trans, or trans with an asterisk, or transgender. The Q meaning queer or questioning. And we often like to utilize the plus at the end because the alphabet increases. Identity is so vast, and there's so many other vocabularies as well too to identify different populations, such as agender, or demisexual, or bigender, or scoliosexual, all of those different manifestations of individuals' identities. Things that we won't necessarily talk about too much today because we don't really have the time. But again, if you all have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Also sex. You know, when we think of sex, we often think of the intimate nature of it, the erotic nature of it. But sex has also been a term to utilize as a sex assigned at birth. So what the doctors assign a child, which we know that could be totally different from what they were actually born with. We have individuals that are born with multiple genitalias, and it's not put in record that there was a gender confirmation surgery or a gender surgery on genitalia for individuals that are intersex. So we know sex assigned at birth is a greater vocabulary to utilize. You may hear other scholars say coercive sex assigned at birth. You may hear that vocabulary, but when I talk about sex, that is male and female. That tends to have a biological, what people say is a biological nature, not sometimes accounting for our intersex individuals as well too. You may see AMAB or AFAB, that's assigned male at birth, that's assigned female at birth. I was assigned female at birth. Also sexuality, which tends to be the identity, you know, how you love, your romantic attractions, and also your intimate attractions as well too. Sometimes they're different. And we also have gender, and gender is different than sex, right? Gender is a social construct. It's how you feel. So sex is sometimes that biological, clinical nature, and gender is that social construct that's based on what society puts on you as well too, and also what you define as yourself. There's genderqueer as well too. That's individuals that don't want to be put in a box when it comes to their gender. They may identify as female, they may identify as woman, but they also may have different expressions that puts them outside of that box. Myself, I identify as genderqueer. There are other people that do too. Gender non-conforming is another term, just for vocabulary. Gender non-conforming is anyone that doesn't conform to the mainstream view of what gender should and ought to be in society standard. And we have trans with the asterisk. This includes and encompasses an umbrella of different identities within the trans umbrella. Individuals that identify differently than what they were assigned at birth. And that's the same thing as transgender. Transgender is anyone that identifies differently than what they were assigned at birth. Feel free to add questions in the chat as well too. So we did a vocabulary check just so you can get some of the knowledge as well too before we start talking about trauma. Again, this can be a very triggering moment for people. So I want you all to situate yourself in this moment. If you feel anything that is, one, uncomfortable, or two, that you feel that you need to have some space away from, feel free to walk away, grab some water, or even utilize the chat to process it out as well too. So there's some examples of trauma, some that people don't always identify as trauma, but it's still legitimate. It's still trauma. Trauma can be discrimination, can be racial trauma. One of my elements of my dissertation research is racial trauma. That experience of consistently being part of a community on the margin that has a veil of race within them, that is traditionally and societally and politically sometimes disenfranchised. And due to that, traumatic experiences can occur. There's sexism, there's homophobia, there's ableism, and etc. Discrimination is a form of trauma. Bullying, and we know, especially working with youth, bullying is a form of trauma. Intimate partner violence, such as domestic violence, sexual violence as well too, community violence. I live in near Northwest. We have a large uptick of community violence in this area. It's traumatic, something we want to definitely address. Human trafficking, child abuse and neglect, domestic terrorism, political and economic trauma, war, food and housing insecurity, and shame. And you're probably looking at this. We have youth that experience them all together. All of these different layers of trauma, we have youth and children that have experienced multiple forms of these just within one person. Whether interpersonally or individually, interpersonally within their family structure, or collectively. So mass trauma. And we know that when it comes to this trauma and this exposure to trauma, if we're not able to mitigate these issues, and particularly when it comes to our LGBTQ plus community and communities on the margins, it becomes a cycle. That exposure of trauma can create increased hypervigilance and risky behaviors, can create involvement in criminal justice systems and other systems such as child welfare systems, and then additional traumatic events and experiences afterwards. And then the cycle can continue as greater traumatic events surface. So what do we do about it? And my colleague, Dr. Megan Oed, developed this amazing graphic with some of the information I gave her about healing-centered engagement. She's a trauma-informed care person. That was part of her research area. I'm a healing-centered engagement person, so we have been able to kind of healthfully blend both the best of both worlds to understand that both are essential in this space. It addresses, so what do we do about it? I'm pretty sure most of you all have heard of trauma-informed care. It's a viable research way of handling youth and individuals that have experienced traumatic events. It addresses the individual needs. It allows for communication as well too, to be empathetic. It addresses systemic issues that worsen trauma. It promotes healthier relationships and develops safety as well within individuals. And it focuses on calming those responses. But one thing that we'll talk about a little bit later on in this training, we'll talk about healing-centered engagement and how that can support LGBTQ plus youth. That's community-focused. Somehow, within our rhetoric of working with trauma, working with individuals that have experienced traumatic situations that have caused them pain and sorrow and agony, we have only said it's the individual's responsibility to fix themselves. What about the community? So healing-centered engagement puts that onus back on the community as being spaces of healing. It provides resources and opportunities for healing. It focuses on ways to empower individuals. And a great way that this empowers individuals is affirming their identity. So we have LGBTQ plus youth, and sometimes we like to de-identify that part of them. Or we like to say they're too young to know. When the majority of the populations that identify as queer when they're young still continue to identify that into their adulthood as well too. We're going to focus on, it allows for individuals to focus on ways to empower individuals, but also addresses systemic issues that create trauma. So not just saying that intimate partner violence or sexual assault, those aspects we know are creating trauma, but it's also identifying those other elements and sometimes elephants in the room, right? Racism. Are we talking about the intersections of the whole person? Are we understanding that our LGBTQ plus youth can straddle many different fences in many different spaces when it comes to operating within their trauma? Those power and privileges collide into a space that can cause multiple forms of harm and trauma within one person. So why LGBTQ plus youth trauma matters? We know it matters. You all wouldn't be here if you all did not want to serve our community, our LGBTQ plus youth. It matters in this space because rates of childhood trauma are alarmingly high. We see research that upon research that proves this. We know that more than 2/3 of children report experiencing a traumatic event by age 16. We know approximately 2 out of 3 children in youth ages 17 and younger were exposed to some form of victimization in the home, and 50% had more than one exposure. And we know that among LGBTQ plus youth, rates of exposure to potentially traumatic events are even higher than their heterosexual peers. And it's already high enough for youth that are heterosexual. But we cannot also mention that there's this layer of race that the community is still very uncomfortable talking about. That when we layer the intersections of LGBTQ plus with other marginalized identities, other communities on the margins, we have to also note that our LGBTQ plus youth of color are most impacted by the child welfare and juvenile justice system. We know that LGBTQ plus youth of color are more likely to enter back into juvenile justice and child welfare systems. It becomes this revolving door. We know that LGBTQ plus youth of color tend to remain longer and face greater risk of discrimination and violence compared to their peers in juvenile justice and child welfare spaces. They're the most impacted by HIV, STD, and AIDS, report victimizations at a lower rate. And that multiple consciousness, so understanding that they operate within multiple spaces of being, where they not only see themselves as individuals of color, but also see the salience and the permanence of racism in society, but also see themselves as queer in a society that's still unwelcoming to queer identities. Those multiple intersections create a likelihood of developing severe mental health symptoms and inability to thrive. And particularly only 19% Black, African-American, LGBTQ plus youth report that they can be themselves at home, with higher rates of abandonment, sexual attacks, and rapes than their white peers. And over 90% of Black LGBTQ plus youth have experienced racial trauma. These are alarming rates. We have to note it, but we also know that this trauma lies within school. We want school to be a welcoming space. We want school to be the space where people can learn and grow and be themselves. But we know that schooling can be a very hostile environment that can promote trauma, not just within peer-to-peer bullying, but also adults that may bully children. From experience from my own daughter, of having had an issue with one of her teachers that was bullying her because of her haircut, because she has short hair. I know for a fact that this definitely occurs, and it's unfortunate. So it's so important to have a safety net and a safe space for these youth to be advocated for. Because I imagine if my daughter did not have a person like me that was very outspoken and to advocate on her behalf, how that could have been traumatizing for her in her development. So we know that this trauma exists. We know that approximately 57.6% of youth, LGBTQ plus youth, felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. And 43.3% felt unsafe because of their gender expression. We know the majority of our LGBTQ youth experience verbal harassment because of their sexual orientation and gender expression. And we know that LGBTQ students were physically harassed because of their sexual orientation at alarming rates, as well as their gender expression as well too. We know that more than half of our LGBTQ students were sexually harassed in the last year. And 63.5% of students who did report an incident said school staff did nothing in response or told the student to ignore it. We have been taught since elementary school, right, that if someone doesn't like you, then you ignore it. Well, we have stats and research to prove that ignoring it does nothing but exacerbate conditions and problems and trauma. That ignoring it, one, shows the person that has been victimized, that's a survivor, that their voice does not matter. But also, two, shows the person that has perpetrated that that particular voice doesn't matter either, and that they can continue to do the same thing over and over again. We know that also more than half of LGBTQ students reported hearing homophobic remarks from their teachers and other school staff, and 63.5% of students reported hearing negative remarks about gender expression from teachers and other school staff. Imagine, you all probably have heard of stories as well too. Staff members and teachers being facilitators of trauma for kids. In addition, transgender youth reported higher levels of harassment, assaults, discrimination than all other students, and the majority felt unsafe being at school because of their gender expression. We talked about this term gender non-conforming. So gender non-conforming youth reported experienced biased behavior, including harsh discipline and being blamed for their own victimization. Being blamed for what they are experiencing. But we also know this family trauma is real as well too. This is going to lead us into this child welfare implications. LGBTQ plus youth are experiencing trauma at an alarming rate with their family. 33% of LGBTQ youth said their family is not accepting of their identity or other people. About half said that they had an adult in their family they could turn to if worried. Hold on one second. Or sad compared to the 79% of non-LGBTQ youth. So we know that support system is less for LGBTQ plus identities. And among LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness, 43% were forced from their homes due to conflicts related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. 43%. And 32% have experienced physical and emotional or sexual abuse at home related to their sexual orientation. Nearly half of LGBTQ youth did not feel that they fit in. And 4 to 10 said that the community in which they live is not accepting of LGBTQ people. Then we can also bring this back home as well too, to Indiana. Up to 40% of homeless teens are LGBTQ in Indiana. 1 in 4 youth experience homelessness in Indiana, and Indiana does not have a non-discrimination law and policies covering LGBTQ students. Indiana does not have an anti-bullying laws and policy covering LGBTQ students as well too. Indiana does not ban conversion therapy for LGBTQ youth, but we know that recently in this session for 2021, there was a bill introduced to ban that. And we know that in Indiana does have some protections for LGBTQ youth in the child welfare system. So we know that this is the space. Child welfare system is setting the tone for what we should do as a state for policies within schools, with how we should handle youth as well too, but we can always do better as well. There's some grave consequences to trauma, and you all know this. You've seen it in the news, you've seen it in stories. Over more than 1.8 million LGBTQ plus youth between the ages of 13 and 24 seriously consider suicide. And it is estimated that at least 1.2 million LGBTQ plus youth aged 13 to 18 consider suicide each year. In addition, at least 693,000 youth aged 19 to 24 seriously consider suicide. So we know that these are alarming rates. We also know that this community also has higher rates of absenteeism, being disciplined at school, lower grade point averages, dropouts of school as well too, have higher rates of depression and anxiety, and lower self-esteem. School victimization in adolescence is linked to young adult mental health issues and increased risk for STDs and HIV. And we know that LGBTQ plus youth are more likely than their heterosexual peers to face challenges that pose a greater risk of exposure, traumatic stress, experiences of discrimination, violence, lack of support, and rejection from caregivers, community, can lead to depression. And we know that also has impact in STD and risky behaviors. Homelessness, we already mentioned as well too, and then also the entrance into the juvenile system and child welfare system. This leads to this child welfare implication. The work that many of you all do and what you're advocating for. We know that if we do not do something, if we don't take proactive steps, then we are continuing cycles of trauma, because we know this by research, about 26% of LGBT youth are forced from their homes. We know that 30% of LGBT youth reported physical violence at the hands of family members. And we know that an estimated 43% of youth experiencing homelessness are forced from their home due to these conflicts. But also 32% of homeless LGBTQ youth have experienced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse at home. These have strong implications for child welfare, because also as well too, it's most likely to be underreported. but overrepresented. LGBTQ plus youth are most likely to be underreported, but also overrepresented in the system. There's a risk of harm, discrimination, fluidity of sexuality, and lack of intake processes that prevent an underreported nature of LGBT identities within youth. And although approximately 4 to 10% of the total population is estimated to be LGBT youth within child welfare systems, a study in LA estimated that there were around 19% of those placed in out of home care. Another research of youth aging out of foster care note that 34% represented a sexual orientation other than heterosexual. So we know that we need greater research, we need greater ways to report, and we need greater representation. We know within the child welfare system, there are experiences that are positive for LGBT youth, TQ youth, but unfortunately there are overwhelming situations of abuse due to LGBTQ plus identities for children in the child welfare systems. We know that they experience risks of verbal and physical abuse that are higher than their heterosexual peers when they are placed in out-of-home care. They have a higher risk of runaway. And we know that 78% of the LGBT youth in one of the studies were removed or ran away from foster placements because of their caregivers' hostility towards their identity. 78%. Also, research has estimated that the percentage of youth who are homeless and LGBT could be as high as 40%. There are research finding that 56% of LGBT youth in out-of-home care have spent some time without stable housing because they felt safer on the streets than group or foster homes. Can you imagine that? Over half of the youth felt safer on the streets than being placed. One study also found that 65% of LGBT youth experiencing homelessness had lived in group or foster homes, and that 39% of these youth had been forced to leave their homes due to their sexual orientations. They're also less likely to find a permanent home through reunification, a family member or kin, or through adoption. And I know these are gloom and doom statistics, but there are ways that we can create a greater and affirming and empowering child welfare space for these youth. And that is through my self-named Affirm method. And this is something that many people have developed different strategies for affirming LGBT youth in this particular space. But this takes a community effort. It takes more than just creating a very catchy name. It takes us coming together and figuring out what is a priority for us within spaces. And this Affirm method is assessing current policies and practices, prioritizing when it's safe to do so, family reunification and education plans, foster an empowering environment through policy practices and protocol, include the ability for youth to be self-identify, to recruit LGBTQ plus affirming and culturally responsive families, and to mitigate harm through mental health and support services. To assess. So what I mean about assessing is that to look at, especially our agencies that may be represented in this space, to look at our current practices for intake, recruitment, communication, marketing that can support an affirmational approach to creating a brave space. And then when I say family reunification and education plans, and this is definitely not new to you all when it comes to family reunification, but creating a stable home for youth is a priority. We know that the high levels and risk of our LGBTQ plus youth aging out and not having family to fall back on. So creating a stable home for youth is a priority, but also ensuring they enter into a safe environment that won't aid and abet harm. So reunification into family is essential, but we have to create education plans that allow for people to understand and work with professionals to understand LGBTQ plus identities as well too, to create that environment of belonging? Do we have individuals that we can go to that will allow for those education and educational moments to be facilitated within families? Also, to affirm fostering an empowering environment. Empowering environments can be facilitated out of the home for out of the home placements, within reunification, and also within agencies. But in order to do this, we have to understand the impact of inclusive language. So how we address someone is important. How we name them, allow them to name themselves is essential. But also being able to allow them to see themselves is also important. So when we are understanding the impact of inclusive language, we have to look through our practices and our documents and our services. We also have to create accountability structures and resources for support. If we know we are working with individuals that consistently demean particular populations, there has to be accountability structures in place. In developing an LGBTQ plus family group with PFLAG, we have great resources within Indianapolis with PFLAG to support youth and family education, and making sure diversity is seen throughout but practiced authentically. We don't want to tokenize diversity as saying, this is what we have, but not necessarily have practices that represent what we say that we respect. Also, another way to affirm that I mentioned is to include the ability for youth and families to self-identify, allowing them to create the option, and again, all caps, option, for them to name themselves by disclosing their chosen or lived name, their identity, their pronouns, their race and ethnicity, and also for families to identify their family makeup and partner identifiers as well too. And those may seem like small steps, but they go a great way in showing that you're facilitating a welcoming environment. Recruiting LGBTQ plus affirming foster and adoptive families. So actively and intentionally doing recruiting methods and increasing training to include LGBTQ plus education. Provide resources and access to an advocate or professional specializing in LGBTQ plus identities. That's going to be essential. That continuing education and that access to someone that can support can go a long way with supporting our youth. And last is to mitigate harm through mental health and support services. We don't want our youth to go into spaces where they feel that they are going to feel harmed. We want to create and refer to services that will be affirmational. So mental health is a very common referral, but also consider transformative justice practices and sessions. Transformative justice is similar to restorative justice, but it is survivor-centered. Cultural affirmation programs and organizations such as Indiana Youth Group. Also like Brothers United and Indy Pride of Color as well too. And also mentoring programs. So what does the actual research say about what is needed for LGBTQ plus youth success? And one of the things that has been mentioned is that resilience. We can do the affirm method, but we also have to understand that building resilience within our youth is essential. Resilience is the capacity to positively adapt to adversity, but it also requires different layers to do that. And this is where you all can come involved. They have to have the ability of at least having one stable, caring, and supportive relationship within an adult. Creating a child welfare system that allows for that to be facilitated is a great step. A sense of mastery over life circumstances. So utilizing that affirm method for great referrals that are culturally affirmative, and strong executive function when it comes to self-regulating skills. So how they cope, and affirming faith or cultural traditions. It's not enough to say, well, you're just a kid. You're not going to understand these particular situations. Youth are understanding and are experiencing racial trauma. They're experiencing homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of phobias that are impacting them. To affirm that within a youth is so important in making sure that they develop the resiliency to be able to develop the skills and mastery over their own lives. So this goes back to this whole healing-centered engagement. We talked about trauma-informed care and how that's such an essential practice. It's still very important. But trauma-informed care is essential, but it's also rooted in harm and injury and trauma. It's deficit-based. It presumes that trauma is an individual experience without understanding the collective. And it focuses on treating trauma without actually addressing the root cause. That's like putting a Band-Aid on an already weeping wound that youth and community members are experiencing. We have to reframe this narrative in a holistic view and approach, and we have to understand the importance of identity and culture and LGBTQ plus identities and racial identities when it comes to making sure that our youth feel that they are resilient. And healing-centered engagement is an approach that allows that to be facilitated. It's holistic. It's culturally relevant and responsive, so it affirms individuals' identities. It can add a spiritual moment if they are spiritually grounded, allowing that to be affirmed. There are so many individuals that are LGBTQ plus in Indiana that feel that they do not have access to their religion or their spirituality that they feel that they identify as, allowing them access to the ability to worship if they choose to. But if they choose not to, that is totally okay as well too. To be civically engaged and also collectively rooted in the healing experiencing, understanding that it's more than just an individual experience, that there are systems that create greater traumas for the collective. So it shifts this essential question from what's wrong with you when we're working with LGBT youth, so from what happened to you to what's right with you. If we're going to affirm LGBTQ plus youth, we have to also focus on what's right with them. We have to affirm the goodness in them. So some best practices as well for serving LGBTQ plus youth with a healing-centered mindset is be culturally grounded in your approach, understanding the whole person, using identity and culture as a way to ground people in a solid foundation and to develop that sense of belonging and self-perception and purpose, to center collective healing as well too. And also using an asset-driven approach. So focus on well-being of what we want to see from them. And acknowledges youth doesn't mean that they haven't lived. So just because they're youth doesn't mean that they haven't lived a robust experience. We know that we have youth within the child welfare system that have experienced life like no other. Affirming that just because they are young doesn't mean that they haven't experienced traumatic situations. And it builds upon a person's experience, knowledge, skills, and curiosity as a positive trait to be enhanced. And also it utilizes those inclusive language that I mentioned before to humanize communities and communities on the margins. So within the child welfare space, either as individuals that are working in agencies or families, we want to also utilize healing-centered engagement. So we want to utilize restorative justice or transformative justice approaches to address community breaches. So we want to be able to name the trauma, name the pain, not ignore it and sweep it under the rug. It's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, something that historically sometimes families we've been taught to not talk about. But naming those experiences allows for individuals to receive their power back. not to think of it as like this dirty secret, but a way to address it. It's also challenging school policies and practices that disproportionately penalize communities on the margins. We know that our children in the child welfare systems are often disproportionately penalized in schools. Being able to challenge those. And also ongoing education and cultural immersion and engagement. So it's not enough to just sit and be part of this training. What are ways that you're going to immerse yourself in this community, to engage with it? And that will allow you to holistically support your youth as well too. To develop a resource coordinator or work with a professional who are open and affirming to working with LGBTQ plus youth and social services and support. Referrals to mentoring and affinity-based programs, and also a greater awareness of how Title IX within our spaces, within our schools, need to be very inclusive to our communities on the margins as well too. Something that people need to be aware of, that they have a resource to, but also accountability systems for maybe educators or even students that may perpetrate against our youth. Seeing the whole child and the intersectional identities, it's not enough to say that we're going to focus on an LGBTQ plus component of a child or a youth. We have to see the whole child, that they not only may be wanting to be affirmed in their LGBTQ plus identity, but they also may want to know more about their culture as an Asian American, as someone that may be Muslim, but also identify as LGBTQ plus as well too. Someone that may be Black and trans. There's more than just one side of an individual, so catering to the whole child. And I will say 100%, this last part, we can have fancy names, we can have check boxes, but if we are not communicating that we are affirming, and if we're not making statements to affirm communities, then people are not going to know. So creating an official statement in support of LGBTQ lives and their ability to thrive in child welfare systems and social services spaces. And this could look like, for agencies, creating inclusive language policy, chosen name policies. This has to be reflected not only how we work with youth, but also how we operate and engage with each other and families. We also have a community responsibility. Keep your eyes and ears and senses peeled to the legislation that is being introduced, the bills that are being introduced that are directly impacting our youth. We know that we have a while to go, and we have mountains to climb when it comes to LGBTQ plus affirming environments, but we know that there are strides being made in our judicial systems. We know that right now there was a bill introduced to ban conversion therapy. We know that hate crimes still needs to have a language that protects LGBTQ plus individuals as well too. We know that there needs to be police training and accountability systems when it comes to identities. We know that when it comes to our intersectional identities within social services and group homes, there needs to be greater accountability structures, education, ongoing training as well too, and advocates that support and specifically work with these particular identities. And more extensive homeless and youth initiatives in the state of Indiana. And we're so happy to have Trinity Haven, but we know that's not enough. We have an issue. We have a societal issue that's an imperative within our community, that over 40% of our homeless youth are LGBTQ plus identified. Wanted to conclude with some community resources for you all to consider to support LGBTQ plus youth and child welfare. I put Prevent Child Abuse Indiana on there. because the fact that they're even hosting this event means that they are a resource, a support. Because I will tell you, there are spaces that may not want to entertain this topic. So I will say hats off and big kudos to Prevent Child Abuse Indiana for doing this event. We have an amazing PFLAG chapter in Indianapolis. The Children Welfare League of America, Human Rights Campaign as well too, our Indiana Youth Group, Trinity Haven that works with our homeless LGBTQ plus youth as well too, Diverse Affirm Group, the Rose Project, and youth.gov has some really great resources as well. This is an extensive list. There are so many other community organizations doing the work, but these are some ones that you should also take note of as well too. So let's chat a little bit. And feel free to raise your hands. Do you have any questions or comments or concerns or even aspects that you would like to add into this as well too?
And I'll try to look for the raised hands if you'd like us to
Yes.
unmute you, or you can even put it in the chat saying, hey, I want to talk. So.
Yes, please. We have a hand.
Oh, we do. Okay, Yvonne, I think I've allowed you to talk.
Oh, it's saying I'm muted.
Nope, we can hear you. But I think you muted yourself.
Can you hear
go.
me now?
Sure
Yes.
can.
Okay. My name is Yvonne Moore, and I am the Focus Needs Director for the Indiana Department of Child Services. Part of my job duties is to develop a human trafficking response system for DCS. But another component of that is to update our LGBTQ practice guidebook that was developed back in 2014. And we currently have a work group that is formed, and we do have a couple of foster parents that will be joining it, and some older youth with lived experience as well. I guess part of what I'd like to say is any resources that you can provide. We've got a lot that we're utilizing through HRC. We've looked at the NASW. We've been in communication with IYG, the Bloomington Youth Pride Group, just folks, IU Gender Health. I mean, just folks across the state to build a better resource, and then to develop training for our family case managers as well. So any input or direction, that you could possibly gear us to, that would be very helpful.
Yes. And
I really like the holistic approach instead of the trauma informed.
thank you. And thank you so much. And I thank you for the work that you do. It's needed. These work groups are needed. And it sounds like you have amazing people also within this work group. I will say for sure, consider healing-centered engagement as a great tool for working with our LGBTQ plus youth. Being able to affirm them culturally and with their identity is essential, especially in the space, in the society where people often delegitimize the experiences of youth, period. No matter, if they're LGBTQ plus identified or not, we tend to say, well, you're young, you haven't experienced life yet. And I think healing-centered engagement is a great tool to be able to develop the language and the practice of making sure that we are working with youth to the best of their potential to bring the best out of them. And that should be our goal. How can we bring the best out of our youth? Not what we think is the best for them.
Right.
Because we tend to do that sometimes. I catch myself doing that with my daughter. Like, I have this trajectory sometimes of where I would want her to be in life, instead of allowing her to name the life that she would like to lead. Now, we want to make sure that there aren't any oppressive aspects within that. We want to affirm the greatness in them. But we also don't want to stifle them in their ability to self-author.
Yeah.
So I will
Thank
send you all the resources, and you'll also have access to this PowerPoint as well, too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Let me see. Yes. Kaylin, I have unmuted you. Now I think you can unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
We
Yes,
can.
I can.
Great. So my name's Kaylin. I am not only a CASA volunteer for the county that I live in, but my husband and I are actually on the track to become foster parents. So I just want to say that I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to do this. I feel like I've learned a lot. My eyes have been opened to things that I may not have considered before. So I just wanted to say thank you. And yeah, this is a really good resource.
Thank you so much, Kaylin, and thank you to CASA as well too. As a disclosure, I've worked with CASA before. I was a survivor of domestic violence, and during that time, my daughter was almost murdered. And CASA sent me an advocate and really helped me navigate the system. So I will say thank you so much to CASA. Thank you to all the advocates as well too that are really standing up for child abuse as well. So thank you. Anyone else? And you'll have those resources as well too.
Looking for more hands. Or again, even if you don't feel like unmuting, please feel free to put in the chat.
Yes, I'm seeing some from Claudia.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping this will be a great resource. Thank you so much, Latanya. Any other questions?
Oh, Kaylin's asking again where she can find local resources for LGBTQ plus in their community. She's in Washington County, and
Washington
yeah.
County doesn't have a lot
Yeah.
locally in your county, but you have some great statewide resources that will be able to support Washington County. And I would definitely reach out to Indiana Youth Group. I would definitely reach out to PFLAG as well too, because they'll still be able to provide resources for you. There's some resources that I added towards the end of the presentation that you will also get access to that. Feel free to reach out to them. And also, if you're not seeing a resource in your community, that could be also a way to advocate for that as well too. Because there are people that will want to still serve your area in that capacity. And although that resource may not be available, that may be something that you can advocate to get.
Thank you for saying that, Jay. Yeah, I guess that's always our feeling too. If there's something that's not there, what can we do to put something there? And with technology too, I don't know how realistic this is, but with technology now, whether there could be, that as a resource now in terms of groups or more learning opportunities. But that's also a possibility.
For sure.
Then I think we have another one from Caitlin. Do you see that, Jay?
I saw this. Hi, Kate. Hi, Caitlin. Caitlin said, my name is Caitlin Reed. She's from Therapeutic Foster Care Case Manager from the Villages. Hey, want to present information to your supervisors to start some kind of support group for foster children as well as foster parents. Was wanting to connect with you directly. Is there a way for us to email? For sure, you can definitely email. I have on the presentation, I included my Ivy Tech information, but in this capacity, I will say to email me on my Affirm email account. And I put this in the link.
And
And
we
maybe-
have it too at
Yes.
PCA.
Phyllis Clark says, what would be in Clay County? And I'm not familiar with Clay County resources. So maybe Sandy, you can touch a little bit on that.
Yeah, that would be like the Brazil area that's kind of close to Terre Haute, which is of course Vigo County, but it may be the same situation, Phyllis. Terre Haute may be and with Indiana State there, I would find it hard to believe that there wouldn't be something at Indiana State. And I know that's, that is a different area. But geographically, that's probably the closest. And like I said, I'd be surprised if ISU didn't have resources. So you might try there, but also what Jay suggested earlier. Yvonne has mentioned that there's a new youth pride group that has started in Vigo.
Oh, great.
Yes. But if you're really, again, Vigo's not Clay. So, what Jay had mentioned earlier in terms of PFLAG and Indie Youth Group, and then exploring virtual options, or as Jay said, what can we do to advocate for something if it's not there?
This is a great group, and with all the brain power and also the connections as well too within this group, I think we can make it happen. Sandy and myself, we serve on the Children's Policy and Law Initiative of Indiana, and this is a very important conversation for us, is how we help to support our community in Indiana at large, not just Indianapolis. I think Indianapolis tends to be sometimes the hub of resources. But we have to be able to find spaces and supports everywhere else. In our rural communities also needed as well too. So I think definitely just finding ways and reaching out to Sandy, and Sandy will reach out to me if needed as well too, to say, we need some help, and we can say, how can we help? There's another question. Thank you so much for speaking up and sharing information. I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ+ community. Appreciate any and all who stand up to protect our rights and just share information. Thank you so much, Caitlin. As someone that's queer identified, this is not just important to me personally, but it's just important for our kids. It's important for us to create a better community than what we experienced, I think that we have an onus and to serve our community in the best way possible. And if we can do that in a way that we can do it together, that would be amazing. Our beliefs can be different. Spiritual and religious belief, they can be different from person to person. But one thing universally that we should agree on, that everyone deserves to live and thrive. And I think we can do that together once we share in that commitment that we want people to live and thrive.
Actually, a great segue, Jay, to the next question from Latanya.
Hey, Latanya. Let's see. Oh, wow, I had to scroll down a lot. Oh, can you read that for me? It keeps on.
I sure can. So, and this is a great question. How do you work with foster or adoptive parents who are not accepting of their foster youth's sexual orientation or identity being expressed differently than what the family believes?
Yes, I think education is so essential. And I think knowing who to connect with for that education is essential as well too. One, it's not best practice to demean someone's beliefs. You can have religious beliefs that are different from person to person. And sometimes it's our knee-jerk ability within ourselves to definitely be on guard for our youth is to automatically put down people that don't feel the same way or don't think the same way. But sometimes we have to educate and find ways and creative ways to educate our communities. And in this moment, I think education is key. Being able to have transformative spaces through transformative justice. So this could be, and when I say transformative justice, very similar to restorative justice, where you can have healing circles and healing spaces where families can come together, that it's facilitated. The way for people to communicate what they're experiencing, but also for family and foster parent education, that this is what it means. This is what the identities are. This is what it means for this particular person, allowing the person or the child to speak up for themselves as well too, to develop that advocacy skill for them to speak on their experiences as well too, but also allow for some education on skills for conflict management. They may not ever understand. They may not ever 100% fully buy in to the child's identity. But one thing that they can do is facilitate respect and the ability for that child to self-author themselves, to develop themselves into the person that they would like to be and who they affirm themselves as, who that they identify as. And one thing we're missing in society is being able to have those skills to navigate those uncomfortable conversations, have those skills and abilities to have a respectful ability to educate, to not demean, but allow children to develop into the person that they want to be. So I think that would be my strategy, but also just resources and referrals as well too. There's a lot of resources I included on this PowerPoint as well too, but there's a lot of resources out there for individuals to get some advice, families to get advice from people that know about LGBT identities, that have worked with faith leaders when it comes to navigating these conversations as well too, and faith-based individuals that may have different beliefs, and how to still have those respectful moments that does not devalidate someone's experiences. They may not ever 100% be sold or buy into it. That is the unfortunate reality. Within this diversity, equity, and belonging and inclusion work that I do, I know when it comes to understanding culture and identity, cultural buy-in operates under a bell curve. And when we think of a bell curve, we think of like upward slope and then down. On one side of that slope, it's the early adopters. They are gun-ho for diversity. They are gun-ho for the LGBT community. Then you have those people in the middle of the bell curve that, they're not sure, they're on the fence. And then you have those people at the latter end called the laggards. And those individuals are not going to necessarily buy in easily. They're going to be resistant. But a way to challenge all sides of the bell curve to be their best selves is to help them develop the skills and tools to, one, have respect, to be educated about identities, and to allow for spaces where communication is deliberative and respectful. Did that help a little bit?
I thought it was wonderful.
Okay.
I thought it was great.
I felt myself ranting at the end.
Not at all. In fact, Latanya says, yes, thank you.
Okay. I was working with a professional who expressed that the LGBTQ community seems to be a fad or it's just popped up. How do you address that line of thought? I think that's also through education as well too. One thing that I often address through a lot of my trainings that I do at Ivy Tech and within the community, I sometimes start with a history lesson. And I talk about different, maybe historical figures in history, and also making note that these particular people were queer identified. One person, especially, it's Black History Month, you all. So I'm going to leave you all also with a Black History Month fact that is relevant to LGBTQ plus identities. If you have heard of the Million Man March or Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, go ahead and put your hand up in your little, your Zoom expression emoji. Most people are, yeah. So everyone's put their hand up. Well, some of the unknown facts about that is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's, one of his best friends, the organizer of the Million Man March, the organizer of most of his protests, was a gay out Black man by name of Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was out of the closet. He was actually slated to be the Dr. Martin Luther King before Dr. Martin Luther King stepped up. And the only reason why Bayard Rustin could not be the face of the movement was because he was gay and he was out. This is something that history has sometimes slid under, but something that we know that's been in existence. Even prior to Bayard Rustin, we've learned about Greek mythology. We've learned about all these things in the past that have also alluded to the fact that there were queer identities previously. We know that within our indigenous native populations, there are identities called two-spirits. And two-spirits are trans identities that they revere. Many communities within the indigenous and native populations revere as very sacred identities. We may call them trans identities, but there are indigenous populations for centuries that have identified these particular populations as two-spirit. This has been in centuries upon centuries old documents and paintings, that these are legitimate identities within particular cultures, even prior to conversations about Caitlyn Jenner and different other figures as well too. These are something that history has acknowledged, but sometimes within our education, we've not really affirmed those identities. So that's a little bit of some past history, but something that you can also drop some nuggets on when it comes to people that may pop up with some of those questions. Giving them that resources. So it may not mean taking your time out of your day to just espouse. It may mean to educate people through giving them resources and say, hey, check out this link from historychannel.com on two-spirit identities. Let me know what you think about it.
So I'd like to say that I'm looking at that almost as a glass half full too, because I'm hoping that means we're just talking about it more and
Yes.
it's out there more, and we have the opportunity to have these conversations more. I would love it. And I think that's partially true, that there's been a lot more advocacy. Hopefully we're empowering people to speak up and to identify as their own true self. And so I'm just hoping that that's a sign that we're just talking about it more too.
Yes, I think it's an incredible sign. I think sometimes, yes, questions and curiosities can manifest in microaggressions. Microaggressions are those slights and those words that are offensive. We want to recognize that it's a microaggression that's offensive, but sometimes curiosity can occur in those moments too. One, we do want to name that it wasn't appropriate, but two, we also want to recognize that within the space of cultural competency, I am always impressed that people sometimes have the skills and the ability and the gumption to ask questions. Because and when you're in a space where you are just settled in your own way and not willing to ask questions about identities, period, then you're not able to grow. So I agree with Sandy. Ask questions. Still be mindful of the way you ask them, because you don't want to be complicit in someone's trauma, even if you're curious as well too.
And we have a couple, do you have a couple more minutes, Jay?
I do.
So Danita Davy, your hand is up, and I didn't know if you had a question, or was it still up from the previous, and if you don't want to. Okay, never mind. But
Okay.
thank you. No
No.
problem. I usually I thought on Zoom that the hands went down after a while, but maybe not on the webinar feature.
I'm not able to see if there's any recent questions. For some reason, it keeps on like going back to the beginning.
I don't see any. Let me see. I don't see any. Let me just make sure on the hands.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Oh.
So I want to thank you, Jay. That was, as always, marvelous and informative. And I wish we, had all day. And I'm sure most of the participants wish as well. So again, if any of you have questions, or you think this is a program you would like to have, I'm going to volunteer Jay again. I'm always volunteering Jay. So please reach out to us. And thank you for your time today. But we'll stay on for a couple more minutes. And Kathy, did you have anything else that you needed to reiterate?
I just wanted to say that I'll email everybody the survey this afternoon. And so if you complete that survey and get it back to me, I'll send you a certificate.
Thank you, Kathy.
Oh,
And hats off to Sandy and Kathy for just organizing this and also keeping me together as well too, because let me tell you, like, emails get lost along the way and pipes get frozen and things, but it's always good to know that there is a Kathy and Sandy to make sure that life gets together. So thank you. And thank you so much for everyone for learning with us. And I hope that you're able to get a little bit of nuggets from this. And I hope that this empowers you all to utilize resources and to prioritize the success of our LGBTQ plus youth in holistic ways. They need us. And as you can tell, they really need us. Our youth is so important for our survival in the world. But we need to invest in them. This is the way to do that.